The clatter of shattered crystal was supposed to be a clumsy mistake. Instead, it was the starting gun, when a 22-year-old waitress leaned over the most feared man in Chicago and whispered, "Run when I drop the tray." Neither knew it would ignite a war that would burn the city down. The Sovereign was the kind of restaurant where the menus didn't have prices, and the patrons didn't ask for the check. Nestled in the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast, it was a fortress of mahogany, velvet, and discretion. For Claire Mitchell, it was just a place to pay the bills. She was 22, a nursing school dropout, and drowning under the weight of her father's gambling debts. She moved through the dimly lit dining room with the invisible grace required of the staff, balancing silver trays and pouring $1,000 wine without spilling a drop. It was a Tuesday evening, November 14th, the kind of biting, sleet-filled night that usually kept the casual diners away. But table 4 was occupied, as it was every Tuesday, by Dylan Corvino. Dylan was a ghost wrapped in a bespoke Tom Ford suit. The newspapers called him a logistics consultant for the city's shipping unions. The streets called him the absolute authority of the Corvino crime syndicate. He was 32, unnervingly calm, and possessed a cold, dark-eyed stare that could freeze the marrow in your bones. He never brought an entourage into the Sovereign. He claimed it was the only place he could eat his veal scallopini in peace. Of course, his driver, Garrett, was always parked right outside in a reinforced black SUV. But inside, Dylan sat alone, his back to the wall, his eyes tracking every movement in the room. Claire had served him dozens of times. He was surprisingly polite, tipped a consistent 40%, and never looked at her with the predatory gaze common among the wealthy men who frequented the establishment. To him, she was part of the furniture. To her, he was a terrifyingly quiet thunderstorm, waiting to break. At 9:15 p.m., the atmosphere in the Sovereign shifted. It was subtle at first. A drop in the ambient chatter, a sudden tension in the maitre d's rigid posture by the front door. Claire was wiping down the brass railing near the bar when she saw them walk in. 3 men. They wore expensive overcoats, but they didn't wear them right. The tailoring couldn't hide the bulk of their shoulders, or the heavy, unnatural way the fabric hung around their waists. They weren't there for the truffles, but it was the man in the lead who made the blood drain from Claire's face. He had a jagged, pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His name was Mick Stanton. Claire knew him because Mick was the chief enforcer for the Irish syndicate, led by the O'Connor family, the very same family her father owed $80,000 to. Mick was a butcher. He was the man who had cornered Claire in a grocery store parking lot 3 weeks ago, pressing a thumb into her collarbone and softly explaining what would happen to her kneecaps if her father missed another payment. What was Mick Stanton doing in a place like this? Claire watched, her breath catching in her throat. As the maitre d' approached them, Mick simply flashed something inside his coat, not a badge, but steel. The maitre d' visibly swallowed and took a step back, gesturing vaguely toward the dining room. The 3 men fanned out. They weren't looking for a table. They were establishing firing lines. One moved toward the heavy oak doors of the kitchen. Another lingered near the coat check, blocking the main exit. Mick Stanton began a slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle, directly toward table 4. They're hitting him, Claire realized, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. They are going to kill Dylan Corvino right here. Panic is a cold, paralyzing thing, but Claire's mind raced with terrifying clarity. If the O'Connors successfully assassinated the head of the Corvino family tonight, they would take over the entire North Side. They would become untouchable. And if the O'Connors became untouchable, her father's debt would be collected in blood. Her blood, the fragile ecosystem that kept her family alive, relied on the O'Connors being kept in check by Dylan Corvino. She wasn't a hero. She was a waitress. But as she watched Mick slip his right hand into his coat pocket, his eyes locked on Dylan, who was currently looking down at a text message on his phone. Instinct took over. "Claire," the bartender hissed. "Table 4 needs their second martini." Claire looked at the silver tray resting on the polished mahogany bar. On it sat a delicate, V-shaped glass filled with gin. 2 olives skewered on a silver pick. Beside it was a heavy crystal pitcher of ice water. She grabbed the tray. Her hands were shaking so badly the ice rattled against the glass. She forced herself to breathe, plastering on the blank, professional smile she used to survive double shifts. She stepped out from behind the bar and began the longest walk of her life. She had to time it perfectly. Mick was 20 feet away, moving slow so as not to draw attention until the last possible second. Claire was approaching from Dylan's right side, moving at a brisk, purposeful waiter's clip. 15 feet. She could see the tension in Mick's jaw. 10 feet. Dylan remained oblivious, thumbing the screen of his phone. 5 feet. Claire's knuckles were white as bone against the silver tray. She reached table 4 just a fraction of a second before Mick cleared the final booth that blocked his line of sight. "Your martini, Mr. Corvino," Claire said, her voice impossibly steady. Dylan didn't look up. "Put it down, please." Claire leaned in close, bringing the tray right over the center of the table. She dropped her head, her lips inches from Dylan's ear, hidden from Mick's view by the angle of her body. She smelled expensive bergamot and danger. "Run when I drop the tray," she whispered. Dylan Corvino was a man who survived by trusting his instincts. The voice in his ear was soft, trembling, and completely out of protocol. A civilian, a waitress he barely recognized, had just delivered a death threat wrapped in a warning. He didn't freeze. He didn't look around to confirm the threat. He simply shifted his weight into the balls of his feet beneath the table and locked his muscles. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting Claire's terrified green ones for a fraction of a second. He saw the absolute, raw truth in them. Claire tilted her wrists. The silver tray slipped from her grasp. The crystal water pitcher and the martini glass plummeted toward the edge of the heavy marble-topped table. Crash. The sound was like a bomb going off in the quiet, jazz-filled room. The heavy crystal shattered, sending shards of glass and freezing water exploding outward. Mick Stanton flinched at the sudden noise, his hand jerking inside his coat. That microsecond of hesitation was all Dylan needed. With explosive violence, Dylan kicked the heavy marble table upward and outward. It flipped, catching Mick Stanton perfectly in the chest just as the hitman drew a suppressed automatic pistol. The gun fired into the ceiling with a muffled pff, raining plaster down on the plush carpets. Chaos erupted. Patrons screamed, diving under booths. As the other two hitmen drew their weapons, Dylan didn't run away. In a move that defied every survival instinct, he lunged forward, grabbing Claire by the waist of her uniform apron. He yanked her violently to the floor just as a bullet tore through the air where her chest had been a second before, shattering a mirrored pillar behind them. "Down," Dylan roared, the quiet, sophisticated demeanor vanishing entirely. He was a predator now, entirely in his element. He pulled a compact Sig Sauer from a holster at the small of his back, a weapon he supposedly never carried to dinners. "Kitchen," Dylan ordered, hauling Claire up by her arm. He fired twice, blindly, over the edge of the overturned table to suppress the shooters, then shoved Claire toward the swinging oak doors. Claire couldn't feel her legs. She was running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She burst through the kitchen doors, Dylan right on her heels. "Get down! Everyone out!" Dylan yelled at the kitchen staff. Pots clattered to the tile floor as the executive chef and his line cooks dove behind the stainless steel prep stations. The distinct, muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire followed them, sparking off a massive hanging rack of copper pans. "The loading dock. Where is it?" Dylan demanded, keeping his body positioned between Claire and the doors they had just burst through. "Back left," Claire stammered, pointing toward a heavy metal door near the walk-in freezers. Dylan grabbed her hand. His grip was like a steel vice and hauled her toward the exit. They slammed through the metal door and spilled out into the freezing, rain-slicked alleyway behind the Sovereign. The cold air hit Claire like a physical blow, snapping her slightly out of her panic. "Garrett," Dylan barked into a sleek earpiece he must have activated during the sprint. "Alley. Now." "We have a breach." Tires screeched at the end of the alley. The headlights of the black SUV cut through the driving rain, blinding Claire for a moment. The massive vehicle fishtailed slightly on the wet cobblestones before slamming to a halt right in front of them. The rear door flew open. Dylan threw Claire inside first. She tumbled onto the plush leather seats, scraping her knee against the center console. Dylan dove in after her, pulling the heavy, armored door shut, just as the metal door of the loading dock burst open behind them. Mick Stanton stood in the doorway, raising his weapon. "Drive," Dylan commanded. Garrett, a massive man with a thick neck, didn't ask questions. He slammed his foot on the gas. The SUV roared, its reinforced tires finding purchase, and rocketed down the alley. 2 bullets pinged uselessly against the bulletproof glass of the rear window, leaving small, spider-webbed fractures in the tint. They burst out of the alley, blowing through a red light onto Michigan Avenue, merging violently into the sparse nighttime traffic. Inside the SUV, the silence was deafening, save for the hum of the engine and Claire's ragged, hyperventilating breaths. She was soaked in cold rain, her neat uniform ruined, her hands trembling so violently she had to clamp them between her knees. Dylan sat perfectly still for a moment, checking his weapon, popping the magazine out to check the rounds before sliding it back in with a sharp click. Then, he holstered the gun and slowly turned his head to look at the waitress shivering in the corner of his car. The streetlights flashed across his sharp features, highlighting a small cut on his cheekbone from the flying glass. His expression was completely unreadable. "Garrett," Dylan said quietly, never taking his eyes off Claire. "Take us to the Astor Street safe house." "Yes, boss," Garrett grunted from the front. Dylan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at Claire not as a piece of furniture, but as an anomaly, a puzzle he hadn't planned on solving tonight. "I'm going to ask you a question," Dylan said, his voice dropping back to that terrifyingly calm, quiet register he used in the restaurant. "And your answer will determine whether you walk out of my house alive tonight." Claire swallowed hard, tasting copper and fear. She nodded once. "Who are you?" Dylan Corvino whispered. "And how the hell did you know Mick Stanton was coming to kill me?" Claire closed her eyes. She had just saved the life of a Mafia boss, betrayed a ruthless hitman, and thrown her entire life into a shredder. There was no going back to the restaurant. There was no going back to her tiny apartment. "My name is Claire," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "And if you want to live to see tomorrow, you're going to have to help me pay off an $80,000 debt." Dylan stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a humorless, dangerous smile. "Well, Claire," he murmured, leaning back into the shadows of the leather seat, "it seems we have business to discuss." The Astor Street safe house was not a concrete bunker, but a meticulously restored 19th century brownstone that smelled of old money, beeswax, and cedar. Behind the heavy mahogany doors, however, the security was military grade. Cameras tracked their every move, and the windows were lined with ballistic film thick enough to stop high-caliber rifle fire. Claire stood in the center of the vast, dimly lit library, dripping rainwater onto a priceless Persian rug. She hugged her arms across her ruined sovereign uniform, her body racked by the delayed tremors of adrenaline leaving her system. Dylan Corvino didn't immediately press her for answers. He moved to a crystal decanter on a side table, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass, and walked it over to her. He pressed the glass into her trembling hands. "Drink," he ordered softly. "It's Glenfiddich. It will stop the shaking." Claire took a tentative sip. The whiskey burned a fiery trail down her throat, but it anchored her, forcing the icy panic to recede. She looked up at the man she had just saved. In the warm light of the library, Dylan looked less like a ghost and more like a very dangerous, very exhausted king. He took off his ruined Tom Ford suit jacket, tossing it over a leather armchair, revealing a dark gun holster strapped across his broad chest over his white shirt. $80,000, Dylan said, leaning against the edge of a massive oak desk. He crossed his arms, his dark eyes studying her intently. "The O'Connors do not send Mick Stanton, their chief executioner, into a public restaurant to assassinate the head of the Corvino family over an $80,000 debt owed by a waitress. The math doesn't work, Claire. Tell me the rest." Claire swallowed hard. "It's my father, Tommy Mitchell. He has a gambling problem. Sports betting, mostly, but he got in too deep with some underground games run by the Irish syndicate on the south side. They started threatening us a year ago. I dropped out of nursing school to work double shifts. I've been handing over every dollar I make in tips, just to cover the interest. But they lost patience. 3 weeks ago, Mick Stanton cornered me. He said if I didn't come up with the principal balance by the end of the month, they would start mailing my father to me in pieces. Dylan's expression remained impassive, a mask of carved stone. And how does that lead you to whispering in my ear right before Stanton pulls a gun? Because Stanton told me that their boss, Liam O'Connor, was tired of living in the shadows. Claire explained, her voice gaining strength. He boasted that by the end of the month, the O'Connors would own the Gold Coast, and the Corvinos would be wiped off the map. When I saw Stanton walk into the Sovereign tonight, and I saw you sitting there alone, I knew, if they killed you, they would take over the city. And if they took over the city, there would be no one left to keep them in check. My father and I would be dead. Dylan stared at her. You risked a bullet to the spine based on a macroeconomic calculation of Chicago's underworld politics? I risked it because I refused to die paying for a hand of blackjack I didn't play. Claire shot back, a flash of fiery defiance cutting through her fear. A heavy silence descended on the room. For the first time all evening, Dylan's cold exterior cracked just a fraction. A look of profound respect flickered in his eyes. He pushed off the desk. Garrett, Dylan called out. The heavy library doors opened, and the massive driver stepped inside. Behind him walked a striking black woman in her late 20s. She wore a sharp, tailored pantsuit, her hair braided meticulously into a crown. She carried a sleek, military-grade encrypted tablet. Claire, this is Maya, Dylan introduced. She handles my intelligence and internal security. Maya, run Tommy Mitchell. Local gambling debts, Southside Irish underground. Maya didn't offer a greeting. Her fingers were already flying across the screen. Give me 90 seconds. Claire watched the exchange, feeling entirely out of her depth. What happens now? She asked Dylan. If your story checks out, Dylan said smoothly. I will send a bag of cash to the O'Connors tomorrow morning. Your father's debt will be erased. You will both be relocated out of state with new identities, courtesy of my organization. Consider it payment for the warning. Claire felt her knees weaken with a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief. Freedom. It was a concept so alien, she barely recognized it. Thank you, she breathed. Don't thank me yet, Dylan warned softly, stepping closer to her. The sheer physical presence of him was intoxicating, a dangerous gravity that pulled at her senses. This war just went hot. The O'Connors missed their shot tonight, which means they will scorch the earth trying to finish the job. Boss, Maya interrupted, her tone suddenly sharp, devoid of its earlier clinical detachment. She looked up from the glowing tablet, her eyes narrowing. We have a massive problem. Dylan didn't turn around, keeping his eyes locked on Claire. Report. I pulled Tommy Mitchell's financials, routed through the O'Connors' known shell companies, Maya said, stepping further into the room. He's not a gambler, Dylan. He's an accountant. More specifically, he was a forensic auditor for a mid-tier logistics firm down by the docks. Claire frowned, shaking her head. No, he hasn't worked as an accountant in 5 years. He lost his license. He's a mess. Maya turned the tablet around, displaying a complex web of financial transfers. He lost his license because he was caught skimming, but he never stopped working. For the past 3 years, Tommy Mitchell has been cooking the books for the O'Connor syndicate. He wasn't placing bets. He was laundering their heroin money. The air in the room vanished. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. We live in a 2-bedroom apartment with peeling paint. We eat canned soup. I work 60 hours a week. It's true, Maya continued, her voice grim. But here is the twist. 6 months ago, Tommy created a backdoor in their offshore accounts. He didn't just launder the money, he stole from them, to the tune of $12 million, the $80,000 debt they were hounding you for. It was a psychological squeeze. They were terrorizing you to see if your father would break and use the stolen funds to save you, thus proving he had the money. Claire's hands began to shake again. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was a white, hot, blinding rage. Her father had watched her exhaust herself, watched her cry over final notices, watched her get shoved against a wall by a hitman, all while sitting on $12 million. Dylan Dylan turned to look at Maya. Does he have the ledgers? If he orchestrated a digital heist of that magnitude, he has the encryption keys and the routing numbers backed up somewhere physical, Maya confirmed. Without those ledgers, the O'Connors can't access the missing 12 million, and they can't pay their suppliers in the cartel. They are broke. Dylan slowly turned back to Claire. The atmosphere between them had shifted drastically. She was no longer just a brave civilian. She was the daughter of the man holding the detonator to his enemy's empire. "Where is your father right now?" Dylan asked, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "At home," Claire whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the betrayal. "He said he was staying in to watch the game." "Garrett," Dylan barked, his demeanor instantly shifting into a tactical commander. "Prep the armored SUV. Maya, get a cleanup crew to Claire's apartment. We need to extract Tommy Mitchell before the O'Connors realize Stanton failed at the restaurant and decide to take out their frustration on the family." "You're going to use him," Claire stated, her eyes locking onto Dylan's. "You're going to use my father to destroy the O'Connors." "I'm going to keep you alive," Dylan corrected, stepping into her personal space. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of wet hair from her cheek. The intimacy of the gesture was shocking amidst the chaos. "Your father made a dangerous play, Claire. But you belong to me now. I protect what's mine. We get him, we get the ledgers, and we end this war before sunrise." The rain had stopped by 2 a.m., leaving the city slick and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. They didn't go to Claire's apartment. Maya had intercepted local police chatter. The apartment had already been hit. It was burning. Instead, utilizing a tracker Maya miraculously managed to ping on Tommy's burner phone, they located him hiding out in a cheap, neon-lit motel near the western suburbs. Garrett kicked the door in, and Dylan dragged a terrified, sobbing Tommy Mitchell out of the room by his collar, tossing him into the back of the SUV. Claire sat in the farthest corner of the leather bench seat, refusing to even look at her father. When Tommy tried to reach out to her, apologizing through a stream of pathetic tears, Dylan calmly unholstered his weapon and rested it on his knee. Tommy immediately shut his mouth and shrank against the door. "The local airspace is a liability." Maya's voice crackled over the SUV's encrypted speaker system from her command post back at the safe house. "The O'Connors have cops on their payroll, watching O'Hare and Midway. I've chartered a private Gulfstream G650 out of the signature flight support terminal at DuPage Airport. It's a smaller, private strip 30 miles west. Flight plan is filed for a secure airstrip in the Nevada desert. You have a 40-minute window before the O'Connors realize where the charter is heading." "Understood," Dylan replied. He looked at Claire, his eyes softening slightly from the lethal glare he had aimed at her father. "Once we are in the air, you are untouchable. Nevada is my territory." "And the ledgers?" Claire asked, her voice hollow. Dylan glanced at Tommy, who was sweating profusely. He handed over a safety deposit box key. "Maya has a team retrieving the drives from a bank in Zurich as we speak. By the time we land, the O'Connor syndicate will be financially erased." The drive to DuPage Airport was a masterclass in tension. The heavy SUV tore down Interstate 88, a solitary black shadow moving at 100 miles an hour. Claire watched the dark trees blur past the reinforced glass. She had woken up this morning worrying about her shift schedule. Now, she was fleeing across the country with a Mafia boss, having uncovered a lifetime of lies, orchestrated by her own blood. They pulled into the private aviation terminal at 2:45 a.m. The tarmac was a sea of concrete, shrouded in a thick, rolling fog that had settled in after the rain. The massive, sleek silhouette of the Gulfstream G650 sat waiting near Hangar 4, its auxiliary power unit humming with a low, powerful whine. A set of mobile stairs led up to the open cabin door, where a solitary pilot in a white shirt waited. "We move fast," Dylan ordered. Garrett parked the SUV parallel to the jet, providing a wall of steel between the terminal and the aircraft. He stepped out first, an assault rifle held tight against his shoulder, scanning the fog-drenched perimeter. He gave 2 sharp knocks on the roof of the car. Clear. Dylan shoved the door open. "Move!" he barked at Tommy. Tommy scrambled out, whimpering, and bolted for the stairs. Claire followed, But as her boots hit the wet tarmac, a cold shiver raced up her spine. It was the exact same feeling she had in the Sovereign right before Mick Stanton walked in. Something is wrong. "Dylan, wait," Claire gasped, stopping dead in her tracks. Dylan turned, grabbing her arm to pull her forward. "Keep moving, Claire." The fog tore open with the deafening roar of a high-powered rifle. The pilot, standing at the top of the stairs, jerked violently backward, a spray of crimson painting the white fuselage of the jet before he tumbled down the metal steps, lifeless. "Ambush! Drop!" Garrett roared, raising his rifle and firing blindly into the fog toward the distant perimeter fence. Dylan tackled Claire, throwing his body over hers as they hit the wet concrete behind the massive rubber tires of the Gulfstream's landing gear. Bullets sparked and whined against the reinforced struts, skipping off the tarmac around them like angry hornets. "They tracked the plane!" Dylan yelled into his earpiece over the din of gunfire. "Maya, how many?" "I don't know," Maya's panicked voice returned. There were no digital signatures. They must have had a physical spotter at the airfield. From the edge of the fog, 3 black SUVs aggressively breached the tarmac, their headlights cutting through the mist, illuminating the rain-slicked runway. Doors flew open, and heavily armed men poured out, using their vehicles for cover. "Give us the accountant, Corvino." A voice echoed across the open space, amplified by a bullhorn. It was a voice Claire recognized, rough, gravelly, and cruel. "Mick Stanton, the table at the restaurant hadn't killed him. Give us Mitchell and the girl, and we'll let you walk away to your little Nevada desert." Tommy Mitchell was huddled near the bottom of the stairs, screaming in sheer terror, his hands clamped over his ears. "Garrett, suppressive fire on the center vehicle," Dylan commanded, his voice cold and analytical despite the chaos. He unholstered his Sig Sauer. "Claire, look at me." Claire's chest was heaving, her eyes wide with terror, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. In the shadow of the landing gear, surrounded by death, Dylan's dark eyes were a singular point of focus. "I am not leaving you here," Dylan said, his voice a low vow that cut through the gunfire. "When Garrett reloads, I'm going to lay down a covering spread. You run up those stairs, you step over the pilot, and you get into the cabin. There is a reinforced door behind the cockpit. Lock yourself in." "What about you?" Claire cried, gripping the lapel of his ruined shirt. "I'm going to finish what started in my restaurant," Dylan promised, a terrifying, predatory smile gracing his lips. "Boss, reloading," Garrett shouted, dropping behind the SUV's engine block. "Now!" Dylan roared. He stepped out from the cover of the tires, exposing himself to the firing line, and began unleashing precise, controlled bursts toward the approaching headlights. Claire didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, her waitress shoes slipping slightly on the wet concrete, and sprinted for the stairs. She vaulted over the fallen pilot, a sob tearing from her throat, and threw herself into the luxurious, cream leather interior of the jet. Outside, the firefight intensified. Dylan moved with lethal grace, a phantom in the fog. He wasn't just defending. He was advancing. He used the cover of the darkness and the smoke, closing the distance between himself and Mick Stanton's position. Inside the cabin, Claire crawled toward the back, seeking the reinforced door Dylan had mentioned. But as she moved past the plush captain's chairs, a hand suddenly grabbed her ankle. Claire screamed, kicking wildly. "Shut up! Shut up! It's me!" A frantic voice hissed. It was her father. Tommy had crawled up the stairs behind her. His face was pale, his eyes darting around wildly. But it wasn't fear of the O'Connors that she saw in his expression now. It was a frantic, desperate greed. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding the pilot's emergency flare gun, and he had it pointed directly at Claire's chest. "The Swiss bank accounts," Tommy gasped, sweat pouring down his face. "Dylan has my key, but I have the voice authorization passcodes. Without me, they can't get the money." Claire froze, staring at the man who had raised her. "Dad, what are you doing?" "I'm surviving, Claire," he spat, his hands shaking. "The O'Connors will kill me, but Dylan will just lock me in a hole once he drains the accounts. I have to leverage the money to buy my way out of the country." He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward the cabin door. "You're my insurance policy. Dylan likes you. He won't shoot if I'm holding you. The ultimate betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Her father wasn't just a thief. He was a coward, willing to trade his daughter's life for his stolen millions. But Claire Mitchell was done being a victim. She was done paying debts she didn't owe. And she was done being used. As Tommy dragged her toward the doorway, preparing to shout out to the men executing a war on the tarmac below, Claire remembered the heavy silver tray at the Sovereign. She remembered the feeling of taking control of the chaos. She didn't pull away. Instead, she lunged forward, slamming her forehead directly into the bridge of her father's nose. Tommy shrieked, his grip faltering as blood immediately spurted from his face. The flare gun discharged into the ceiling of the cabin, filling the small space with blinding red light and choking sulphurous smoke. Claire dropped her shoulder and shoved him with every ounce of strength she possessed. Tommy stumbled backward, tripped over the raised lip of the cabin door, and tumbled backward down the metal stairs, right into the line of fire. Tommy Mitchell hit the wet tarmac with a sickening crunch, his scream drowned out by the piercing shriek of the Gulfstream's engines. The blinding red light of the emergency flare illuminated the fog-drenched runway, casting long, demonic shadows across the concrete. The sudden burst of crimson light broke the rhythm of the firefight. From behind the barricade of a shattered SUV, a gravelly voice roared, "Cease fire! Cease fire!" "It's the accountant!" Mick Stanton stepped out from the swirling mist, his assault rifle lowered but ready. The remaining O'Connor men held their positions, their weapons trained on the crumpled figure, bleeding on the ground. Tommy groaned, rolling onto his back, his face a ruined mask of blood from Claire's desperate headbutt. He threw his hands up, his eyes wide with a pathetic, groveling terror. Mick! Mick! Wait! Don't shoot! "I have the codes," Jonathan Bradley at the Zurich branch. "He won't release the 12 million without my voice authorization." Mick Stanton walked slowly toward him, the heavy thud of his boots echoing over the idling jet engines. He didn't look like a man interested in banking. He looked like an executioner who had just found his prime target. "Liam O'Connor sends his regards." "Tommy," Stanton spat, his voice laced with venom. "He wanted me to tell you that the penalty for stealing from the Irish syndicate isn't a repayment plan. It's a closed casket." "No! Claire! Tell them!" Tommy shrieked, looking up at the cabin door where his daughter stood trembling, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal frame. But Claire didn't say a word. She stared down at the man who had sold her life for a stack of offshore accounts. The universe was balancing its ledger, and she refused to interfere. Stanton raised his weapon, aiming directly at Tommy's chest. "See you in hell, accountant." Bang. The shot didn't come from Stanton's rifle. Mick Stanton's body jerked violently forward, a dark flower blossoming between his shoulder blades before he collapsed face first onto the wet concrete. From the shadows beneath the Gulfstream's massive wing, Dylan Corvino stepped into the red light, his Sig Sauer still raised. He had used the distraction of Tommy's betrayal to flank the Irish enforcer. With their leader dead on the tarmac and the element of surprise gone, the remaining O'Connor men broke. Tires screeched as the surviving SUVs threw it into reverse. Fleeing into the dense fog, Garrett sprinted from the front of the aircraft, his weapons scanning the dark perimeter. "Clear, we are clear. Boss, we need to go now." Dylan didn't look at the fleeing cars, and he didn't look at Tommy Mitchell, who lay sobbing uncontrollably next to Stanton's corpse, a broken, ruined man left for the police sirens wailing in the distance. Dylan's dark eyes were locked entirely on Claire. He took the metal stairs 2 at a time, holstering his weapon as he reached the cabin door. He reached out, his large, warm hands gripping her shoulders, pulling her away from the edge. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice dropping its icy detachment, revealing a raw, urgent panic that had never existed in the quiet dining room of the Sovereign. "No," Claire breathed, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her legs weak. She leaned into his chest, inhaling the scent of bergamot, gunpowder, and rain. He tried to trade me." "I know," Dylan whispered fiercely, wrapping his arms around her, pressing a kiss into her damp hair. "But you didn't let him. You fought back. You are safe now, Claire. You are with me. Wheels up." Garrett shouted from the cockpit, taking the dead pilot's seat. Dylan pulled Claire into the luxurious cabin, securing the heavy door and locking out the chaos of Chicago. As the Gulfstream G650 roared down the runway and pierced through the stormy cloud cover into the clear, starlit sky, Claire looked out the window. Below them, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers surrounded the airfield, swarming the man she used to call her father. The karma was absolute. 4 hours later, the jet touched down as the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains surrounding Henderson Executive Airport. A sleek motorcade was waiting, arranged by Richard Sterling, Dylan's fiercely loyal Nevada fixer, as they drove toward a sprawling, heavily guarded estate hidden deep in the desert. Dylan reached across the leather seat and took Claire's hand. His grip was an anchor, a promise of protection and power. She had walked into her shift as a desperate waitress, drowning in someone else's sins. She was walking out as the only woman Dylan Corvino would ever trust. The shattered crystal at the Sovereign didn't just break a quiet Tuesday evening. It shattered Claire's entire reality. She traded a life of fabricated debts and stained aprons for a world of dangerous truths and armored SUVs. Dylan Corvino kept his promise, erasing her past to secure their future. In the unforgiving Nevada sun, the waitress who whispered a frantic warning finally found the ultimate strength to fiercely rule forever.